On Tech News Today, the FCC votes on net neutrality, Google gets flooded with takedown requests in Europe to remove links, and Apple's acquisition of Beats misses a beat. All that and more coming up right now.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Tech News Today is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Tech News Today for Thursday, May 15th, 2014. This episode is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website or online portfolio. For a free 2-week trial and 10% off, go to squarespace.com and use the offer code TNT. Welcome to Tech News Today. I'm Mike Elgin.
I'm Jason Howell.
Tech News Today explores the big stories of the day with some of the world's best journalists. Our guest co-anchor today is Robert Hernandez. Robert is an assistant professor of professional practice at USC's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad to have you here, even though I went to UCLA. So you guys are the other guys in LA, right? But
oh boy, it's gonna get awkward. I didn't realize.
Yeah, go Bruins. Anyway, so I wanted to ask you. You have an interesting career. You've spent a lot of time as a journalist and a very innovative journalist. But what do you do right now at USC?
I'm a digital journalism professor, which is a vague term that essentially what I describe is I'm a mad scientist for journalism. I hijack technology to advance journalism. And that's manifested in a variety of different courses and projects that I've done. The most recent one is a glass journalism course that I'm teaching in the fall, where I'm bringing in journalism students and engineering students to develop news and journalism apps for the glass platform. Experiment with augmented reality. I augmented the downtown LA library for a project. So it's very much that amorphous digital journalism thing. I'm the weird guy. I'm the weird nerd in the corner hijacking journalism and advancing it. I think that's in my business card.
Well, we need more weird nerds in more weird corners, and so I'm glad you're doing that. And I also, last time you've been on the show one time this year, and at that time I asked you to come back after your course is over, the Google Glass course, so we could do sort of a recap about what happened. And that invitation, of course, I just want to be clear, is still open. I'm really curious to see how that goes, because this is pretty bleeding edge stuff.
Thank you. We've actually had one meetup already. The 12 students got together, including one that was Skyping in all the way from Argentina. We've met, we've planned, and you've got to think about this. These are students who are in the middle of finals, wanted to get together to start preparing for a class that doesn't start till August. That's pretty impressive, and it's a really great crew. So honored to come back and talk about what we've learned.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to it. So let's get right into today's news. Of course, the big news today is the FCC. The Federal Communications Commission today voted in favor of a preliminary proposal by Chairman Tom Wheeler to allow paid prioritization or internet fast lanes, which could kill net neutrality in the United States. But the FCC asked for additional public comment, including whether the internet access service should be reclassified as a telecommunications service or, a common carrier like the telephone system is. And with us to discuss this is Sebastian Anthony, who's a writer for PC Mag and Extreme Tech. We also have John Healy, an opinion columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and Alex Wilhelm, a writer for TechCrunch. So we'll start with you, Alex Wilhelm, because you're on the screen. How would the new rules, if they were actually adopted, change the internet in the United States? You get the big question today.
Well, what's very frustrating is we haven't actually gotten our hands on the full text. They released a preliminary overview right after the vote, so we have kind of the gist of it, but not the final details. So on something this complex, we're going to want to make sure we get into the weeds and get a full understanding. But right now, it appears that the overall net neutrality chunk will be no blocking of content, no slowing of content, and some paid prioritization with very strict rules about what that means. This is a disappointment. I think that everyone on this show today would be in agreement that we didn't want this to happen, that there would be any paid prioritization allowed. But happily, we have a 60-day period to input comment and then 57 more days of reply. So we have about 4 months to debate and discuss this. So it's not a done issue yet. But certainly this wasn't the vote we wanted to see this morning.
Now, it seems to me that Tom Wheeler is playing the politics on this thing like a violin. As I understand it, there are 3 general levels of regulation. And, of course, regulation is a big hot-button issue for the right. Now, this vote split across party lines. The 3 Democrats on the panel agreed with going forward with these proposals. The 2 Republicans are against it. And as I understand it, there are 3 levels. As I said, there's reclassifying this as a public utility, which is the maximum regulation. It would basically make internet providers like the phone company, where they have to do exactly what the government tells them to do. So that's maximum regulation. The minimum regulation is what Tom Wheeler is proposing, and he's basically saying that we'll regulate it a little bit, and there'll be this whole process for redress if people feel like they're not getting the internet service that they paid for, and so on. And then the absolute minimum regulation is where there is no net neutrality, and it's just whatever the internet providers want to do. So what he seems to be doing, and this is just my own view, is that he wants the middle road. He wants the little bit more regulation route, a little bit of net neutrality, a little bit of not net neutrality, and he's dangling out this public. He's allowing 3 or 4 months of public comment on this to talk in part about whether or not we reclassify these things as public utilities. That's the poison pill, essentially, for the right. They don't want maximum regulation, and of course, he doesn't want zero regulation. So it seems to be that he's playing this so that he gets exactly what he's after, this thing that he's calling something that preserves net neutrality, which in fact does not preserve net neutrality. Now, John Healy, this is my own personal view, and can you tell me if that is inaccurate in any way?
Well, it's inaccurate in the sense that you just used the word fact. First off, as Alex noted, we haven't seen the proposal. We're talking about what we know from a fact sheet. So the devil's in the details. We need to get into that. But as Wheeler has said repeatedly throughout this process, he doesn't want to change the goals that the FCC set in 2010. The problem, as the courts have said, not just in earlier this year, but before, when the FCC tried to enforce a very similar set of principles that hadn't been adopted as rules, is that there are limitations on the FCC's authority. So the question is, what's possible here? If Wheeler is saying that he really doesn't think that the FCC can allow a universe that has fast lanes, and he thinks that Section 706 authority is the way to achieve that, let's have a comment period and let's hear what people have to say about that. Not saying from the very start, oh, well, he's committed us to a set of fast lanes. I mean, if you listen to just what he said at the meeting today, and you read the speech that he gave to the cable show a few weeks ago, it's pretty clear that this guy doesn't want to have the universe that people are saying he's leading us toward.
Well, and I'll throw this open to Sebastian Anthony in just a second, but my own view is that he's counting on the ignorance of the public here, and so those of us who watch a show like I'll explain that. I'll explain that in just a sec. The reality is that over time we the public expect internet speeds to get faster and faster and faster. He's saying that it's net neutrality is protected because the companies won't be able to dial it down. In other words, they won't be able to force a slow lane. So theoretically, if speeds stay the same for people who are not paying the carriers extra, right, then that is within the limits of what he's proposing here. I mean, we expect carriers like Comcast and so on to continuously upgrade their networks, but if their incentive is to get paid by the people who pay extra for a fast lane, then what incentive does Comcast and the other internet providers have to provide faster internet connectivity for the rest of us?
If you look at what he said about the no blocking rule, which admittedly is edgy legally in terms of 706 authority, but he said that the way they're approaching this is that content providers have to have access to their end users without having to pay for that. And end users have to have access to content providers based on what their expectations are for what they're paying for. In other words, if they get slower and slower service, that would be under the Wheeler definition of commercially unreasonable, that would be commercially unreasonable.
Exactly. So, Sebastian Anthony, I mean, can you address this essential point? I mean, clearly, I don't think anybody's expecting the internet to get slower. He's basically saying if it gets slower, that's against the rules, and we'll address that. Our expectation is, if everything else being equal, that it should get faster and faster and faster, as it has done over the last 2 decades. We expect internet speeds delivered to the home for every, for a given dollar to be double, triple into the future. But again, what's the incentive for the internet providers to double and triple it for those of us who are not paying, who are not getting content by people who are not paying for it? Sebastian Anthony, what do you think about that?
As John mentioned, so we have Wheeler saying one thing. Like, he said some amazing things. He said, there is one internet, not a fast internet, not a slow internet, one internet. So I'm quoting him there. And he also says the internet must be fast, it must be robust, it must be open. So he says all these things, and then apparently we're voting for fast lanes, or that's the actual proposal is for fast lanes. So there's a disparity here between what he's saying and what we're proposing. And so, I mean, on the one hand, you have the politics of it. Like, if they can get this in, if they can kind of slip this in and we can start doing the fast lane thing, and then, as someone mentioned, that the consumer, they're ignorant to this, and so it will just happen without noticing. But on the other hand, it's a dangerous precedent to set. And as you say, internet speeds get faster and faster. But also it's worth noting that none of these companies like Time Warner, Comcast, they're not hurting money-wise, and they're not spending huge amounts of money on infrastructure as it is. They're saying that they need these fast lane rules to protect their infrastructure investments. But, I saw a graph today that shows, with inflation-adjusted spending, their spending is not increasing. And the previous rule in 2010 from the FCC didn't increase spending either. So I think there's a lot of, it doesn't seem, there's maybe some lies floating around or some, it's not entirely clear what's actually going to happen here and what people actually want and what's political and what's trying to fleece the consumer. It's a complex situation, and I'm worried that the FCC will try and slip something through that we will then not have much control over.
I think that's exactly what Wheeler is trying to do. Now, Robert Hernandez, there's this whole question about how the mechanism of enforcement works. So people who are in favor of net neutrality, and especially who want reclassification, want a system where it's essentially illegal for people to pay for any sort of priority of any kind. So that means the default is net neutrality. The proposal that Wheeler is been approved today, essentially to go forward, is the opposite of that. It's sort of like the opt-in, opt-out question on social networks and so on. That now the default is that companies can go ahead and pay for prioritization, and then individuals have to complain, and then the FCC can look at that and decide whether or not they're going to enforce it or not enforce it, and so on. And so it seems to me to be opening the door for a slippery slope away from net neutrality. Robert Hernandez, what's your take on the nature of that proposal as we go forward here?
Sure. Like John said, we don't know the details just yet, but what is clear, it's an attempt to define what is the floor and what is the ceiling. And the concern is that the floor just stays and freezes, while the ceiling of speed, if you will, the internet speed, you've got to pay to go up. And that does not equate to net neutrality. That equates to those who can afford it can go faster. And we see that now with consumers having different data plans. But the expectation is, if I'm paying more, what am I getting? We've got to keep that in mind. We've got to figure out what is that floor. That's that big debate. And I'm curious to see how for the next 4 months this debate will manifest, how people will roll up their sleeves and go out there to protest and voice their concerns. That's the first test, opposed to waiting for this to kick in and then complaining after it's been made into law.
Now, Alex Wilhelm, Wheeler says that his net neutrality proposal was being misinterpreted. What does he mean by that, do you think? Why does he keep saying that people don't understand what it is he's trying to do?
Well, it's really hard to answer that because we still haven't seen it. But I think he thought that he had found some sort of middle way, some middle pathway through this issue that threaded the needle and allowed for your three systems to kind of work together and have some regulation, not too much regulation, and keep everyone kind of happy. And I think there's a natural tension there you can't really harmonize. I'm not quite sure you can have anything close to net neutrality, which implies actual neutralness, and still allow for paid prioritization, as I think Robert pointed out. So I think that he thought he got to a place that was going to make everyone happy, and he got an explosion in his face. And that was probably a large surprise to him. He's been scrambling to change this thing, to try to make it somehow feasible and perhaps passable. But I just think that it was a tone thing on his end that he thought he had pulled it off. And in reality, no one's happy.
I think the main problem is that people don't quite understand why ISPs should retain some kind of control. Like, the internet has flourished the entire, last 20, 30 years based on the fact that we have treated ISPs like common carriers. Over here in Europe, for example, we just passed a rule that says the ISPs must be common carriers. And I'm not entirely up to speed on American politics, but it is just odd that this comes along now. Like, the internet has been net neutral for a long time. There's been a few examples, like when the cable companies have their own interests, like Comcast has a streaming TV service, so they compete with Netflix and that kind of thing. But for the most part, cable companies have been very net neutral for a long time. And I don't see why this has suddenly come up that, we need to start adding fast lanes and that kind of thing. Like, these companies make a lot of money. The internet has grown very, very well. A lot of Silicon Valley is basically predicated on this, open web that we have. And I don't see a valid reason for suddenly putting restraints and fast lanes and prioritization on the internet. But
Sebastian, you've just made the point that opponents of regulation make. It's been since 2002 that there have been no restrictions against. There's been no common carrier treatment. No common carrier treatment of broadband ISPs. And in that time, there have been a couple of notable examples of non-neutral treatment out of tens of thousands, maybe millions of potential problems. There's only been a couple. And so opponents of regulation say, yeah, why do we need rules? And so what the FCC says, and what Wheeler says, and I take him as being sincere on this, is that they want to preserve the status quo. So that it's not a matter of moving away from neutrality now. It's a question of how do you preserve the status quo, and how do you do it without getting thrown out in court?
So, John Healy, what is the downside of reclassification? Why not just reclassify it? What's the downside?
Well, two downsides. First, Title II includes such things as universal coverage and price regulation that make total sense for a lifeline phone service and do not make sense for broadband. So in order to go to Title II, you'd have to also simultaneously forbear from much of Title II. So you'd be saying, okay, we're going to use this new regime, but then we're going to eliminate most of the rules under that regime because they simply don't apply, because it was written for a different century. Okay? Title II dates back to the 1930s. The other reason not to do it is because you would get tied up in court forever. And then Congress, particularly if it goes to complete Republican control after this next election, Congress strikes back by shutting off your funding. So it's a really dangerous route to go. But to give Wheeler some credit here, one of the changes between when he announced his thinking about the ruling and what they're supposedly putting out today is that we'll have a much more robust discussion of the relative merits of Title II versus 706, which is one of the things that I don't think he's getting any credit for here. People rushing forward to say, stop the FCC, stop the FCC. If you move forward with this process, you have a chance, you being proponents of Title II, you have a chance to make your case. Don't you want that?
Now, Alex Wilhelm, are you concerned about the growing power of the internet service providers? I mean, we've been covering two stories that are relevant, three stories that are relevant to this conversation. One of them is the proposed acquisition by Comcast Time Warner, and the other one is the proposed acquisition of DirecTV by AT&T, and then the third one is this whole issue of net neutrality. Are we headed for a world, assuming that everything is approved, all the acquisitions and the new rules for net neutrality, are we headed for a world in which Comcast and AT&T have way too much power? They can not only determine the speeds at which all of us have internet connectivity based on who's paying and who isn't paying, but also they, between the two of them, control the majority of the internet connections in the United States, and will be able to essentially dictate the terms to the internet companies, to the content providers, and could do so in favor of their own versions of those products, for example, their own content. Are you concerned about that, Alex Wilhelm?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's kind of I think the core fear we have here. I mean, when you remove competition by allowing large corporations to combine and only have 2 or 3 incumbent players, they work in their own self-interest, right? That's just standard market capitalism. And I'm in favor of that, but also we need to keep in mind that competition is what keeps innovation moving forward. And if we're going to allow for these mega mergers to occur, we're going to see, a consolidation of power among just 2 or 3 people, and that's, that worries me. Especially in this context of paid prioritization, because if you combine these large companies, they'll have even more power and more money to pursue their own interests in regards to net neutrality. And if we open up that door and we make them stronger, they can push a lot harder on it and change the dynamics of the internet and the market for content and internet delivery. So yeah, this is a fear that doesn't keep me up at night yet, but certainly could down the road.
All right, well, Alex Wilhelm, I want to thank you for coming on Tech News today and helping us sort through this very complex issue. Alex Wilhelm is, you can find him on TechCrunch.com and also on Twitter with the coveted name of Alex.
Indeed. Thanks for having me.
And thank you. And Sebastian Anthony, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Sebastian is at mrseb.co.uk and also on Twitter at mrseb. Thanks again. And John Healy, thank you as well for coming on. Appreciate your time today.
You're welcome. Could I just throw in one more thing just to correct the record a little?
Yes, very quickly.
Okay. If you read the summary that the FCC has put out, it says first off that it will explore the question of whether paid prioritization should be per se illegal. So it is going to explore whether prioritization will be a tool available at all. Second, it says that there will be a rebuttable presumption that any self-dealing, any favoring by an ISP to affiliates would be illegal. So the notion that folks are putting out there that we're going forward definitely to create fast lanes through prioritization, and that we are definitely going to have the NBC Universals of the future being favored by the Comcasts, I mean, the record just doesn't reflect that.
All right. Well, I appreciate that point of view. My own view is that they're reversing the mechanism. They're leaving themselves the power in the future to enforce, not enforce, and of course, it's not what proponents of net neutrality want. They don't want a system in which it's up to the whim of whatever political power, whatever party is in power, to decide whether they want to enforce or not force, and have it go back and forth depending on whether we have a Republican or a Democrat appointing who the FCC chairman is, et cetera. But anyway, I appreciate your point of view. We got to run on this story, and I thank you very much for joining us today. You can find John Healy at latimes.com and also on Twitter at JCAHEALEY. Thanks again. Well, in a sec, we're going to tell you about the other big legal news story, which is Google's new getting slammed in the European Union. But first, I want to tell you about Squarespace, the single best website in the universe, where you can build a website of your own that is just beautiful and high performing. Net neutrality, no net neutrality, doesn't matter. Your Squarespace site will be beautiful and perform awesomely. Squarespace has 25 beautiful templates for you to start with, and they've recently added a logo creator tool. That means you can create your own logo and have it appear on your site. You can also use it elsewhere on the site. And you can check out the logo creator tool at blog.squarespace.com. They have a video there that will tell you all about it. Squarespace is incredibly easy to use. You just choose from one of the templates, and then you can customize it. Very easy and intuitive. You can see the website in real time as you're modifying it. And no matter what type of device it's being viewed on, whether it's a phone or a tablet or giant screen desktop, it's going to look perfect for that medium because Squarespace always redesigns itself on the fly depending on what device you happen to be using. And of course, it's mobile ready for you as well as a website owner because you can modify and check site stats and do other things with your site from a mobile device using the Squarespace Metric app for iPhone and iPad. So start a free 2-week trial today with no credit card required and start building your website. When you decide to sign up for Squarespace, make sure you use the offer code TNT, and that'll get you 10% off, and that'll also show your support for Tech News Today. And we thank Squarespace for their support of Tech News Today. And remember that a better web awaits, and it starts with your new Squarespace website. Well, we told you this week about the European Union Court of Justice ruling that Google must remove or edit information or links from its search engine upon request. The so-called right to be forgotten ruling was unexpected and greeted with controversy. Requests for Google to delete links are already pouring in, and advocates of the right to be forgotten say the ruling is welcome. Opponents say it amounts to censorship and reduces the value of the internet. And the Wall Street Journal this morning reported that German privacy officials say Google is already working on a process for handling complaints about links, and we're expecting that process to be made public in a couple of weeks. Joining us to talk about this is Julian Hatham, who's a reporter for The Hill. Welcome, Julian.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Glad you're here. So what does the EU court now require of Google when people complain about links? What are they asking for here?
Sure. So essentially what happened is the court said that if you have a problem with Google, there's some information there, whether it's accurate or not, and it's embarrassing or no longer relevant was the phrasing, you can ask Google to take it down. If they decline, that can eventually go to the court system. But that's obviously created a lot of problems for Google, who now might have to deal with hundreds or thousands or potentially millions of these takedown requests. And it's been pretty controversial in terms of free speech and free press and a lot of things here stateside as well.
It's incredibly controversial, and for very clear reasons. If something, if somebody posts something that you don't like on the internet, whose right prevails? Is it the right of the person to have something that they don't like or that's inaccurate or no longer relevant according to the language of this ruling? Or is it the right of the person posting it, the right of free speech and so on? I mean, could such a ruling ever happen in the United States because of the First Amendment? Is this even possible?
I mean, probably not. As you know, Eric Schmidt said the other day in a meeting with investors in a conference call, there's the right to privacy, but there's also the right to knowledge. And there's they meet in the middle somewhere. And it seems like what's happening in the EU is that the right to privacy is on that balance kind of winning out. But there is no First Amendment in the EU. There is no right to journalistic freedom in the EU in the same way that we have here in the US. So probably nothing that sweeping could ever really happen. At least lawyers that I've talked to seem to think that's possible in the short term. But there are some kind of half measures that are in effect. California, for instance, passed a bill last year to allow a similar kind of erase button for the internet for teenagers and for children. The idea is essentially that if you're a kid, you should be able to take down some information, or your parents should be able to take down information that could be embarrassing or could be controversial that you post online. Other states have followed suit, and there's been some talk about a national bill. For Congress here, there was a bill that was introduced. It hasn't gained a super lot of support, but this new effort from the EU could support that. But these are all targeting, like I said, children and not necessarily adults, at least for the most part so far yet.
Now, Robert Hernandez, this case that ended up putting these demands on Google and also other search engines. And by the way, this is about search engine. This is about links to information. It doesn't require the removal of the information at its source, just the links to that information. But Robert Hernandez, this started with a Spanish lawyer who demanded that Google remove links so old news articles about his horrible financial situation be removed. Apparently, years ago, this guy had all kinds of financial troubles, and he's rectified those, and now his financial picture is looking fine, but he's still, when people search for his name, they get all these news articles, or they used to get all these news articles about how much debt he had. So is that a reasonable, do you think that's a reasonable demand for somebody to be able to essentially expunge that information? His argument was that that's no longer relevant, and it's no longer accurate, and therefore should not appear on the internet. What do you think about that?
That's a really tricky one to answer. When I was at the Seattle Times, we would get requests from people. We would profile that stories we would profile about people who turned their lives around. That they were drug addicts, but they found a way to turn their lives around, and now they're better off. And a year or 2 years later, after we did those profiles, we did get contacted by our subjects asking for them to be removed from our archives because of just that. They wouldn't be able to. They found that it was difficult for them to get employment because HR does what every HR person does now. They Google you, and those results are really, really powerful. It's for me, I lean towards transparency and knowledge, where context is really important, and those subtleties sometimes are overlooked by someone who's just Googling you. But the truth is, I lean towards having that out there. My question that I want to ask is this only for Google and for other search engines that operate in Germany? Do they get to have an honest version of the internet, or does this apply to Bing and others?
Julian Haddam, you want to take that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the ruling was just a couple of days ago. It's still pretty soon, but my impression is this applies across the internet to every website. But that also makes a problem for people in the U.S., for multinational companies like Google, because if I search for information about this Spanish guy who's had tax problems and his home was repossessed, I can find it here on American Google. But in European Google, I might not. And the same might be true of other sites. And so, it creates problems for these companies across the board, really.
Ultimately, this is a contest between the right to privacy and the right to free speech. In Europe, they tend to emphasize the right to privacy over free speech, and in the U.S., it's the opposite. The other thing about this that's sort of surfaces cultural differences between Europe and the United States is that this ruling in the EU puts the burden of judgment on Google. Google decides what information is relevant and what isn't, what information is no longer current, and so on. So that's kind of a, if you will, a very un-American idea that a private company, a publicly held company, would be in the position of making these judgments about public knowledge. Is this going to create a huge problem? I mean, already Google receives requests to remove links to 5.3 million web pages a week, roughly, based on alleged copyright infringement. So somebody says, oh, they stole my content, that they ripped off my blog or whatever, that sort of thing. Now, in addition to all that, they're going to be having to judge whether information is, quote, relevant, unquote. I mean, that's quite a burden for a private company to deal with, don't you think, Julia Haddam?
Absolutely. And it's a burden in terms of time, but it's also a burden in terms of paying people to look at all that stuff, and you have to hire compliance experts to deal with all these rules. And of course, there's dozens of countries in the EU. They all might have slightly different interpretations of this commission ruling. So it could certainly be a major pain for them to deal with each and every response, which is why some concerns that I've heard have been along those lines of that there's already people who are concerned about companies being too willing to take down information that might potentially violate copyright on the notice and takedown comment period. And there's a lot of concerns that if they get any complaint and any request to take down any link about anyone, that the bias will be on taking it down just because it's such a big process to have to deal with, rather than to fight it and go through all the ins and outs and judge all the real nuances there.
Well, Julian Haddam, I want to thank you for coming on Tech News Today. Now, you write for The Hill, which is a political publication. Most of the guests we have on the show write for technology publications, or they're technology journalists for general publications. Can you tell us a little bit more about The Hill?
Sure. So we cover Congress. I'm here in the basement of the Capitol right now. This is a very attractive background you can see behind me. But we focus on the politicians and some of the regulators. Some of my colleagues have been at the FCC all day today, looking at what's going on over there. And we try and track the movers and the shakers on this side of the country and this, inside the Beltway, especially for me as it relates to technology policy, communication, surveillance, things like that.
Well, wonderful. And I thank you again for coming on Tech News Today.
Thank you for having me.
You can find Julia Haddam at thehill.com and also on Twitter at jmhattem, Hattem. Well, the Chinese company Xiaomi unveiled today in Beijing its first tablet. The Android-based MiPad, M-I-P-A-D, is the same size as an iPad mini, but costs only $240. The tablet comes in fruity colors, and its design looks similar to Apple's iPhone 5C line. In fact, it looks like an iPhone 5C style tablet, but in fact, of course, it runs a forked version of Android. Robert Hernandez, this is a really interesting company because they have something that is akin to the Amazon model. They break even or lose money on tablets, and their intention is to make money on services later, and that's one of the reasons why they can have such a low-priced tablet. The other thing that's interesting about this story is that Xiaomi is not a company that has a lot of mind share in the United States, but in fact, they're the #6 smartphone vendor in the world. They are a huge company and growing probably faster than almost any other company in the world. And of course, they're focusing on China, but ultimately they're going to take the Samsung model, start in China, and then go to the emerging markets, and then eventually they're going to end up right here selling us cheap tablets and giving Apple a real headache. What do you think about this market in China? It's really fascinating to see these upstarts just beating everybody on price and also coming out with some pretty compelling devices.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how this tablet rolls out. It is very much the Amazon Kindle model where they sell you hardware at a lower price so they can make money as you use their services. I don't know how they'll break into this market here in the U.S. There's a lot of cheap tablets that you see being sold at Walmart or Target, and other players have been in there, like the Nook. Is that still around? But we'll see how that rolls out. I think definitely it has a lot of potential. And you said something that made me a little bit nervous. It looked like the iPhone 5C. Let's hope there's no lawsuit or anything like that of patent wars or things like that. Dare I say that word?
Yeah, lawsuit in China is a tough nut to crack. And of course, those of us in the United States and also in Europe tend to think that the tablet market is kind of petering out, but in fact, it's expected to grow nearly 40% this year. But most of that growth is in China, where Xiaomi is really hoping to dominate with this new tablet. So it's still a fast-growing market for these companies if you can sell to consumers in China, especially. Well, in other tablet news, Samsung sent press invitations today for an event called the Galaxy Premiere 2014, which will be held in New York City, June 12th. And I think we're expecting several new Samsung tablets. And from the look of the invitation, it looks like they're going to be emphasizing color. So just like the Xiaomi tablets, which come in many colors, and it looks like they're going to come in colors. I think that's what happens when products begin to become commoditized. They start coming out in multiple colors, and that's why you buy it, because it's yellow or it's pink or whatever. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting event, and we'll certainly be covering it here because everything Samsung does is potentially big news. So we're going to be covering it here on TWiT. Well, we told you last week that Apple's pursuing a $3.2 billion acquisition of Beats Electronics. This morning, Recode's Peter Kafka reports that the deal may have been delayed until sometime next week. The report didn't say what caused the delay. Maybe it's because they realized it was a horrible idea. What do you think, Robert Hernandez? What do you think of this whole phenomenon of this company that makes mediocre headphones that can be manufactured for $15 but sold for $300 being bought by Apple and sort of integrated into their whole universe of overpriced hardware? What do you think?
Mike, I guess I'm picking up on your point of view on Beats. But, you have to, for better or for worse, you have to acknowledge the fact that they made these luxury items or overpriced headphones that people are willing to buy. You can see that connection with Apple products where you can get something where it comes to hardware comparable to a tablet or a phone or a laptop, but people are willing to pay more for it. For that luxury brand, for that kind of fashion identifier type of item. And Beats falls into that category. Now, I'm assuming that you're not going to get gifted one. I don't have one at the moment. But there is something to Beats by Dre that is a lot more on wearables than it is for that not great musical app that they launched. But I think one theory I heard was Apple trying to buy into this wearable, recognizable brand. There's not much wearable things that you can do with earbuds, but when you've got a clunkier headset, there's some stuff that I've seen. I've seen a Kickstarter where the headband kind of rolls down and a screen projects there so you can do some viewing. I don't know if it's a bad idea. It's an odd one for sure for Apple to do this. So I'm not surprised it's being delayed.
Well, I think you've absolutely nailed it. What's really happening, in my opinion, is that there's a coming merger between consumer electronics and the world of fashion, simply because anything that you wear on your physical person is part of you. So, for example, if you go to get a pair of glasses, or you go to get a shirt, or you go to do anything, or get a tattoo, anything that's going to be really close to you and be part of your personal identity, you're going to be willing to pay more for something that conveys what you want to convey about who you are. It's about personal identity. It's about status. It can be about just about anything. Tribal affiliation. You know, you want to say, I'm a Dodger fan, so you're going to get a Dodger hat. Well, that's a decision that people make as a point of self assertion. And the world of that world of fashion and sort of paying extra for brands that say something about yourself, and the world of consumer electronics, there's a colliding because of wearable computing. And wearable computing is fashion. Fashion is going to become computerized. And so this is really the world that we're headed for. And I think that this, you know, this Beats acquisition by Apple is one part of it. The fact that that Apple itself hired a bunch of fashion people to work on their wearable computing electronics is a big deal. The fact that if you look at how you the Tech News Today viewer, how do you feel about Google Glass? Do you love it? Well, people who love Google Glass, it's a clunky, dorky looking thing. And for some people, that's what they want to project. I'm a person who likes functional, powerful, the latest technology, and this looks like that. For probably the majority, it looks dorky, and I don't want that on my face because it looks dorky. That's another decision people are making about self, about how their self is perceived in the world. And a lot of people have said, well, if they could make it look really cool and make it more minimal and more elegant and more fashionable, then I would buy it. So, you know, this is the conversation we're all going to be having in consumer electronics. It's an odd one for us because we usually like speeds and feeds and power and utilitarianism, but those days are gone with wearable computing. This is fashion, and I think we all have to get used to it.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, well, Robert Hernandez, that's the Tech News Today. I want to thank you for coming on the show today. I really appreciate your views on all this stuff. I hope to have you back again soon.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
Glad to come back.
All right, thank you. Well, you can subscribe to Tech News Today, and we highly recommend it at twit.tv/TNT. You can also subscribe at youtube.com/TechNewsToday. Follow us on Twitter at Tech News Today TV, and we want to hear your opinions. Comment on Twitter or Google Plus using the hashtag Tech News Today. Send us an email at tnt@twit.tv or leave us voicemail by calling 260-TNT-SHOW. If you're ever in the San Francisco Bay Area and want to come up and be in our live audience, we have an awesome live audience here today. All right. We want you to come in and watch the show live. Don't miss our evening newscast, Tech News Tonight at 4 p.m. Pacific tonight and every weeknight. My name's Mike Elgin. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow.